the Underground New England Real and Unpolished webinar as we explore the true state of trafficking in 2024 and what you can do about it. The Underground New England is a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to play our role in eradicating human trafficking in Connecticut and the general New England as a whole. We do that through four focus areas. Namely prevention, survivor support, awareness, and partnership. And that's the reason why you are here this evening, because we believe greatly in partnership, working together to eradicate this evil from among, our neighborhood. And so we're just so excited to be able to share a little bit with you about what human trafficking is. There's no way we can cover just the subject in this one seminar, but we just want to give you an idea of what it is, what it looks like in our communities right here in Connecticut, and what the underground is doing and how you can be a part of that. It's our responsibility to take care of each other. There are people who are trapped in this darkness of human trafficking, and we have a light. We have the responsibility to shine that light into that darkness, and that's what we're doing as the Underground. We are a faith-based organization, and we believe that we are the hands and feet of Jesus, and we are the ones with the carriers of his love and his light into this dark space. And so we just want to welcome you. And now I'm just going to hand over to Amy as we move right into what we want to share with you this evening.
Well, hello, everyone. It's great to see so many people here. Here's how I would define human trafficking. And this is kind of based off of, it is based off of the federal definition. So when you're talking about human trafficking, there's two different categories, right? There's sex trafficking and then there's labor trafficking. And this is going to be primarily focused tonight on sex trafficking because that's what the Underground really specializes in. But, we'll touch on labor trafficking a little bit as well. So when you're looking at labor trafficking, that is the exchange of goods for forced labor. So you're looking for force, fraud, or coercion, and the exchange of goods. So it doesn't have to be money. It can be food, clothing, housing, transportation, anything in exchange for forced labor through force, fraud, or coercion. And then when you're looking at sex trafficking, the definition is a little bit different because it depends on whether they're under 18 or over 18. So if somebody's under 18, you're looking for the exchange of a sexual act for good through force, fraud, or coercion. But the important thing to know with sex trafficking is if someone is under 18, any exchange of a sexual act for any type of goods is automatically considered trafficking. Once somebody turns 18, in order to legally prove trafficking, there needs to be force, fraud, or coercion. So just to give kind of an example of that, if you have a 17-year-old who wants to take an Uber ride and the Uber driver says, I'll give you a ride in exchange for a sexual act, that's automatically considered trafficking. But if that 17-year-old turns 18, gets in the same Uber with the same Uber driver says the same thing, now we have to prove that there was force, fraud, or coercion. So there has to be like a third-party pimp. The Uber driver has to be forcing the person, or there has to be some coercing or tricking, like maybe they think they can't have any Uber rides unless they provide sexual acts, something like that. So that's kind of like the very cold technical definition of human trafficking. But I think, Nadine, and my heart for tonight is really to not spend too much time in the technical side and to be able to just share a little bit more of the story side with you. Nadine, do you want to jump in and say anything?
Sure. Because a lot of times we hear of trafficking and it's just seem like such a distant phenomenon. And we don't just realize just how close it is. And we have these narratives, or we've heard these narratives of, what we've seen in the movies of the kidnaps, of, strangers coming in and taking someone. And we don't realize a lot of times that trafficking is closer to home than we think or would even like to know. And so that's one of the things we want to do this evening. And I think it's appropriate right here, Amy, that we share some of the stories. And we call them stories, but they really are real people's realities. It's the account of, the experiences of some of the people that we've worked with.
Yeah. And I think before I dive into those stories, I want to give y'all kind of two caveats. The first one is this is a little bit different from our usual awareness events. So in our usual awareness events, we're pretty data heavy. And there's lots of graphs and statistics and all of that. But tonight, we really wanted to go in a different direction. So if you want to hear all of the data and charts and statistics, come to one of our awareness events. We're going to be doing more events and more webinars. This is just the first of many. And then the other caveat I want to give is these stories, like Nadine said, they are real people. And we're going to try and not go so deeply into the details that we're all traumatized after this conversation. But at the same time, the reality is that trafficking is a very dark world, and the stories are dark. And I think it's important to kind of shine a light on some of those stories in a way that's respectful and not too traumatizing. So I would just say, if anything that we share is bringing up really strong emotions for you, if you're feeling overwhelmed, please feel free to mute us, step away, do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. The nice thing about this being a webinar is no one's even going to know if you have to step out of the room. So please make sure to take care of yourself. This might bring up a memory, might remind you of a friend or a family member.
Or it might just too hard to handle mentally.
Yeah. So I think the first story I want to share, and I kind of referenced this in one of the emails that I sent out earlier. There's a woman that we've been working with for a little bit, and I think something that was so poignant to me about her story is that she was trafficked for several years before she came to the underground. So, she was, not all trafficking is violent, but her story certainly was. It was a ring of a couple individuals that were trafficking her. They were very violent. In her very first phone call with me, she was telling me, all the places on her body that she has scars from the violence that they did to her. And one of the things that came up in the conversation was, do you want to talk to the police? And she was like, yeah, I really want to talk to the police. I wasn't able to talk to them before because the traffickers knew where her family lived. And so they told her, if you do anything, we're not just going to hurt you, we're going to hurt your family. And that was very powerful for her. And it was a really, real threat. So that stopped her from going to the police. And the reason that she feels like she can, talk now is her family is no longer where the traffickers are able to reach them. So that to me stood out. But then another piece of her story is she tried to escape from the traffickers at one point. And this brings us to something that a lot of adult survivors are dealing with, which is felony charges. So as part of trying to escape, she tried to steal some money from someone so that she had resources to get away from the trafficking. And it didn't work. She ended up ending back up with the traffickers. But now that she's out of the life, she's facing felony charges for that attempted theft. So on top of trying to recover from the trafficking that happened to her for several years, and on top of wanting to reach out to the police and talk to them about what happened to her and help them find the traffickers, she's also dealing with these felony charges that could be coming with jail time, could be coming with restrictions on where she can live, what she can do. So it's just this very heavy burden that she's dealing with right now, to have to deal with each one of those things, right? Like sexual trauma, really difficult to recover from, trafficking, violence, physical violence, blackmail, threats to your family. And there's, other details that I'm not even going into because I don't want to reveal too much about her. And then on top of that, dealing with felony charges, dealing with the court, even if nothing else of that has happened, is so difficult. Like, I freak out when I see, not that I've ever been pulled over for speeding, totally, but I freak out when I see a police car behind me because I was going over the speed limit.
Yeah,
And that's kind of the extent of my interactions with the law. So imagine like multiplying that, having to go to court multiple times, court's not where you're living. So it's just it's a big burden that she's dealing with, having to deal with that.
it is. And a lot of people don't realize, a lot of times we don't realize until we work with these individuals, or we're supporting them or having conversation with these individuals, that trafficking is it's much more complicated than what we see or what we believe, what we hear. It's much more complicated than someone kidnapping you and taking you away. It's much more complicated than what we so glibly refer to as prostitution. You mentioned the financial abuse. You mentioned the fact that she had to steal to protect herself or provide for herself, and now she's facing charges. And after that, there's also those well, of course, facing charges, so now she has to deal with the courts.
Mhm.
And that is a whole other level of complications for a survivor, like like this one who be trafficked across the line, you know, drugs, violence, just the usual parts of the stories that we hear. And now she has to go to court um, to get the protection. This time
Mhm.
is not, because she's facing charges, but she wants to get protected from, but this person is so unfamiliar with the court system. Um, and also of course, there's a fear of, you know, law enforcement, but also the individuals who's advocating for her, her lawyer, is
Mhm.
unfamiliar with trafficking. So
Yeah.
there's just, a lot of complications that survivors of human trafficking face,
Right.
both while they're in the life and as they come out of the life. And that's why, an organization like the Underground is so very important for that journey, to keep them, onto that journey of health and wholeness.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know we don't want to spend too much more time on this, but I think just to give kind of a contrasting story, because those two that we've kind of shared, those are both more violent situations. There's very physical threats that they're fleeing from. But I'm thinking of some other stories, and it's hard to identify this as just one survivor story because so many have told us some version of the story, right? Which is their boyfriend getting them into the trafficking situation. And I remember one individual that I've worked with who was, several years past her trafficking, was doing really well, and we just happened to connect and start talking about trafficking. And when we first started talking, she was like, "Oh yeah, I wasn't trafficked. I was just, experienced sexual abuse, or I was exploited." Um, she actually referred to herself as a prostitute, and I was like, "Oh, I kind of don't like that word. You can use that, but I don't like to use that word to describe people because I think that there's pretty much always some level of coercion that's involved." And so then we
Mhm.
started talking about her a little bit more, and she shared more of her story. And I was like, "You know what? Actually, your boyfriend was trafficking you." And she was like, "Oh, is that what that was?" Because her boyfriend was putting her out on the streets to turn tricks,
Mhm.
to bring in the money, and then he was taking that money to pay for drugs. Um, and to her, she felt like, well, that was just her being a prostitute
Helping her
because she wanted,
boyfriend.
right, she wanted to help the
Yeah.
boyfriend, she wanted the drugs as well. Um, but the reality is he was the one that was coercing her into that life. He was surrounding her by people who were trafficked, so she didn't even realize that this wasn't normal because everybody else around her was in that situation. And so it was a
Mhm.
very, I almost want to say more subtle form of trafficking because there wasn't, that first story I share is like very obvious violence. Like,
Yeah.
you're going to be hurt, your family's going to be hurt. Whereas this one, it's so much more subtle to the point that she didn't even realize she was being trafficked. but he knew what he was doing.
Yeah, and that's the subtlety that misses a lot of us sometimes because there's not isn't the presence of violence or overt force. um then it's not trafficking, and even like you mentioned, the individual didn't even realize that she was being trafficked because we've had situations, encountered situations like that, Amy, where individuals I'm just helping my boyfriend, but
Mhm.
without realizing that they're being coerced into this. Would you rather be doing something else? Do you enjoy doing this? No, but I have to help my boyfriend, but that is trafficking.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm gonna lose housing if I don't help my boyfriend this way. Well,
Yes.
that's
And,
coercion.
and unfortunately, we're going to address that later this evening. That's another big issue that that survivors face.
Right.
Um, and we're going to talk about that a little more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So it sounds like a good time to talk more about what survivors want.
I can't remember if one of the women in that video says it in the video or she just told this to me in person. But she, part of her experience was that she was in prison for a while after the trafficking happened. And she said, what I really wanted was an agency, was somebody who knew what I was going through to come and meet with me and help me, start to rebuild my life and get back on the right track. So I think that's one of the first things that I want to point out that survivors say they want is that social support, right? To come alongside them and support them. And I just want to pause for 1 second and point out if anybody wants to put questions in the chat, please feel free to do that. So yeah, I think one of the first three things, Nadine, I would want to point out that survivors say they want is community. And you hear it in the statistics, like every study, every survey there is on adult survivors. One of the top three things they say they want is some community. But then we see that just working with clients on a day-to-day basis. One of the biggest things when we ask them, what they value or what they need, one of the biggest things they say is that they wanted to be heard, that they wanted community, and how much it means to them to have someone come alongside them and say, I get it, I'll help you walk through this.
Right. And another thing that they say they need is housing. And that's one of the things that Underground is trying to provide as much as possible. Um, and one of the biggest challenging housing challenges for survivors is usually at the moment of exit. Um, they need to find a place that is safe, first of all. A place where they're not, threatened with the possibility of being found by their trafficker. A place that does not trigger, traumatic experiences. And then there is that transcends into long-term housing and how to navigate the housing landscape and to secure adequate and safe housing for themselves in the long term.
Right.
And a lot of times we get questions or we get offers, individuals offering, um, or trying to connect us with shelters and other safe houses like that. And you want to talk a little bit more of why some of these places are not really conducive to the mindset of a survivor.
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about what housing looks like for adult survivors and why this is such a huge barrier. I mean, obviously housing is hard for everybody in Connecticut right now, right? Like it's hard to find an apartment. The ones that are super expensive. The cost of housing, like I was just looking up, I was curious how much our house is worth now. It's doubled since before 2020 in terms of worth. And I promise you, the house has not changed since before 2020. And so it's the same thing. Like our clients are trying to find apartments, and there are these honestly crappy places that are costing them $1,500, $1,700 to get into. So that's one piece of it. But then, well, you say, okay, well, if they can't get their own apartment, can they go into a shelter? Is there Section 8? Is there government housing that they can get into? And when you look at shelters, and then you look at the trauma that survivors have been through, being assaulted by strangers, being attacked in unexpected ways, just kind of a constant barrage of abuse. And then you put them in a shelter, which the last time I was in a shelter, I was just struck by how huge and wide open the sleeping room was. It was just this big open room, tons of beds in it. There were kind of partitions, but it wasn't rooms. It was just kind of makeshift partitions between the beds. And so there was no privacy. There was no sense of like safety or security or a way to get away from all the other people. And I've heard so many stories from clients of like, yeah, I was in a homeless shelter and I got assaulted. I was in a homeless shelter and I got trafficked. Or I think something we have to really be aware of with trafficking is that because it's not entirely violent, there's this element of recruitment. Like there's this brainwashing and this mindset that traffickers deliberately put on you of like, this is the life, this is how you live, this is how you take care of yourself, this is how you pay for food, this is how you pay for housing. And so when somebody's coming out of the life, they haven't necessarily unraveled those narratives yet. And you put them in a homeless shelter, you put them in a group home. And if there's even one other person in that situation that is open to trafficking and goes to that person and says, hey, come meet my boyfriend, he'll help us out. And now they're back in a trafficking situation. So it's triggering, it's emotionally triggering, it's emotionally, mentally, physically exhausting. It's not safe in terms of they're vulnerable to being trafficked again by people in the shelters. And then on top of that, if they are fleeing from a violent trafficker, like that story that we shared earlier on, where they're making very real threats against them, they can find them in the homeless shelter, no problem. These aren't secure locations. You can look them up online. So there's just like a whole host of different reasons that homeless shelters really aren't a good option. Even if they can get a bed in them, which is, it can take weeks in Connecticut to get a bed in a homeless shelter.
So what then are the better options for survivors of human trafficking?
Well, when it comes to housing specifically,
Yes, when it comes to housing.
When you're talking about housing, I think there are kind of two paths available in Connecticut, at least, that I think are good options. So one path is you go into a transitional house, and that's like a 2-year program. It's free housing for those 2 years. You have wraparound services, staff are in the house 24/7, and they kind of help you acclimate and build a new life, and they help you get a job, and they help you build up savings until you can get your own apartment. That's a great option. The thing is, those homes can only take like 8 people at a time.
Yeah.
So they can only take 8 people at a time, and a lot of people don't want to do that because there's a lot of rules, there's a lot of restrictions. It can feel, even when it's a really well done program, it can still feel infantilizing. And so a lot of adult survivors really struggle to go into those programs, even if there is an opening. But what we find is there often isn't openings. And so the best thing that we've been able to figure out is we partner with sober homes and other homes like that, where it's a relatively safe environment. It's often a private location. Sorry, just to answer your question, Lori, yes, there is one transitional living program in Connecticut. I think they have a total of 16 beds between their 2 houses. And so what we do is we partner with sober homes because it's relatively safe. You have people who are on a journey to recovery and are not going to drag other people down with them. They're trying to move forward in life. And of course, the barrier there is you still have to pay for these homes. You're looking at $500 to $800 a month to get a room in one of these homes. And for somebody who's coming right out of trafficking, they just don't have those resources, which is where we come in, right? Because if we have the funds, we can pay for up to 6 months of that temporary housing.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how the underground helps survivors with housing. But the other thing that we have identified that survivors generally say they want is financial support.
Right. And that's a huge one. I mean, that's such a broad category because there's so many different things that you need money for. We mentioned in some of the emails we were sending out about this that trafficking's gotten worse. And one of the reasons that it's harder now to be a survivor in 2024 and that trafficking is worse in 2024 is how expensive things have gotten, right? Like we've all experienced inflation. We've all seen our grocery bills go up. We already touched on how the housing costs have gone up. One thing that happened, there was this brief respite for a couple years during 2020 and a couple years afterwards, where bus transportation was free. And that was
Yeah.
huge for our clients because they were able to get to work, they were able to get to the grocery stores, the doctor's appointment, like all of these essential places you need to go, they could go for free. And then the end of 2023, we stopped doing that. And now it costs $63 a month to get a bus pass in Connecticut, which might seem like a small amount to us, but when you have literally no income, that's a huge amount of money. So that's just one example of financial assistance. But there's so many other things. There's financial debt that traffickers have incurred. So traffickers will often write to people's credit cards, their social security numbers, and drive up debt for them. There's the bills that you weren't able to pay because you were being trafficked. So we had one person in our program who didn't pay car taxes for several years because they were being trafficked. They weren't getting their bills. And if they were getting them, they didn't have the mental headspace to be like, okay, I'm experiencing the worst trauma of my life, but let me call up the State Department and pay my tax for my car. That's just not how our brain works. And so there was like an $1,800 tax bill that he was faced with once he started trying to rebuild his life. So that's an example of the financial support that they need. There's so many different ways. If you want to clear your record, there are some things that you have to pay for in order to get your record cleared. So there's all of these little ways that we have to spend money in life. If you want to get your birth certificate, you have to spend money. There's just so many different ways.
Yeah, I was just about to say that if you want to have a job, there's some documents you need that you don't have that, will cost money to get those documents.
Or if you want to drive a car to work, but you have to register it, that's $200 right there. Yeah. So all of these little things that add up to thousands of dollars.
So Amy, how do we rebuild?
That's such a good question. And I see so many great questions coming in the chat. And I just want to let you know that we are going to get to them if we don't naturally answer them. So feel free to keep putting them in the chat. So how do we rebuild? We've talked about like, what do survivors say they need, right? They want community. They want help with housing. They want financial assistance. And I just want to say like, that's just like 3 things. Like there's so many more things we could touch on. The legal assistance that they need, the credit repair that they need. There's so many different things. I could talk to you for an hour about each of the different things. So we're just focusing on 3. So how do we rebuild? I mean, we touched on this a little bit, and this is where we really get into what is the underground doing to support people. And this is why we have our adult mentor program, because we started out doing awareness events. And then we had so many people coming to us and saying, well, now what? Like, how do I get help? Where do I go? And we started looking around and we saw that especially for adults, there just wasn't that many resources in Connecticut. There's a lot of different resources in Connecticut. I like to think of it as like there's a patchwork of resources. But when you're homeless, when you're struggling with complex PTSD, when you're struggling with fleeing from a trafficker, you don't necessarily have the capacity or the know-how to figure out how to navigate this complex system and to figure out how to get all the resources you need. And so that's, I guess, kind of where the adult mentor program comes in is, where to start. So we specifically hire peer mentors. We do peer and ally mentors so that right off the bat, there's somebody there who's like, yep, I lived through what you went through. I know what you've gone through, and it's possible to get better. It's possible to heal. It's possible to build a new life. So there's that like instant community connection. There's 2 mentors. So you have 2 people on your side. Again, that trying to build community. And then just to kind of take you through like the 4 phases of care so that you can see. And Nadine, do you want to pull up that image of like what the journey to healing looks like, all the different steps that you have to go through? I think that's really helpful to see like just how much work it takes to rebuild your life after trafficking, because you kind of start in phase 1 and you have to get emergency housing. You have to get your basic needs met. You need a phone because usually the trafficker is able to track you via the phone. You might need emergency medical care, or you may need medical care because you haven't seen a primary care doctor for 10 years because you don't go to the primary care doctor while you're being trafficked. So there's all of these things. You need referrals to all of the different resources that can help you. The government resources like SNAP, which is the food support. You need referrals to get disability. There's all of these different things that you need. And so we do this really intensive 10 to 30 days where we're paying for a hotel stay, we're paying for a new phone, we're getting you clothes, we're getting you food. We're holding your hand while you fill out the paperwork to get long-term resources for yourself. And a really big piece of what we're doing is helping you figure out housing. Where do you go? Do you want to go out of state? Do you want to go to a sober home? Do you want to apply to transitional housing? We kind of walk you through that and we help you fill out the paperwork because it's so overwhelming. I think one of the biggest challenges for somebody coming out of trafficking is that first 30 days can be so overwhelming to go from this life of control and abuse, which as hard as it was, you knew what was going to happen the next day. You knew where you were going to sleep at night when you finally got to sleep. You knew your trafficker was going to provide food. And then to come out of that and have to figure everything out all at once, while processing, you know, this onslaught of traumatic memories that are coming at you. It's so intense. And that's why you kind of have to have that mentor walking alongside you. And then you move into phase 2, and that's where it's like, you got to get short-term housing. You can't stay in a hotel forever. You have to start paying those financial bills that accumulated, you know, that we just referenced. And then I think a really big piece that you have to do in healing, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, is you have to rewrite those narratives. You have to undo that brainwashing. I think the best metaphor for understanding what it's like to be a survivor of trafficking is to think about the experience of somebody who's coming out of a cult. And there's so much, when you're in a cult, it's the only world you know. And then you have to come out of it and you have to figure out a whole new way of living. You have to figure out a whole new way of thinking. And it's a lot of work, and it's really tempting to go back because you know what was back there and the future is new and crazy and unknown. And so that's where we bring in these programs that are specifically for survivors to help them change those narratives. So we provide these group opportunities to start to identify those narratives, that this is all you can do, this is all you're worth, this is just what life is, you can't do any better than this. All of these narratives that are holding them down and dragging them back into trafficking, we start to unravel those in those groups. And that's a really big piece of the emotional work that a survivor has to do at the same time that they're getting housing and getting those finances paid off and all those other things they're trying to do.
Yeah.
And so then, you know, you've gone through exiting exploitation, you've transitioned, and now you're into stabilization. Hopefully at this point you have housing, you are in school, you've got a job. And so it's like, how do I stabilize this? Because it's one rodeo to get out and one rodeo to get into a house, to get your first job. And then it's a completely different rodeo to stay out, to really cement those narratives that you can do a different life, to really build a safe community around yourself. Because one of the biggest struggles is cutting off those old people, especially when you're dealing with that subtle kind of trafficking where there's no obvious physical threats. It's so tempting to leave that number in your phone, to stay in touch with this girlfriend that's still in touch with a trafficker. And that's a thread that just slowly starts to pull you back in. And again, that's where you need the mentors. You need that community walking alongside you, modeling a different way of living, kind of coaching you through staying in this new life you're building for yourself. And Marianne, that is such a good question. I'm going to get to that real soon. I love that question. And then you get to phase 4, and we call this independent living. And this is the goal. If you've made it through all of these steps, and I have to say, Nadine made this picture, y'all. She made it look so pretty. It's this pretty linear line. You go down it. If I could draw what it looks like for somebody on the road to healing to actually get from point 1, exiting exploitation, to point 4, independent living, it's going to look like this, and a little bit of this, and
loops and turns. Yes.
And that's really a key part of the mentor's role, is to kind of be this voice of stability as you're going in circles, and as the trauma is pulling you in circles, to be this stable voice that keeps kind of pulling you back to the road, pulling you back onto the path, encouraging you to keep taking the next step forward. Even if you feel like you've gone backwards, it's okay. Just take the next step forward. And then eventually you get to independent living. And even there, we think it's really important to continue to provide community. So still come to our group events, still, because we have community events. We're going to do artwork. We're not just going to do heavy emotional labor because that's exhausting and you're going to burn out and not want to stay on the journey to healing. So we're going to do artwork. We're going to have a day in the park. We're going to watch a movie together. And that's something that even if you've graduated our program, like, please still come do those things, because now you're an example to the people behind you of like, yes, you too can become like this. So that's kind of like the big picture of like, okay, what does it look like for a survivor to heal, right? And I just want to throw some numbers on there because I saw a question asking what it costs. So, before that, yes, thank you, Nadine, our rental assistance program. So we talked about housing, and one of the things we've realized is there are years-long wait lists for housing in Connecticut. So Section 8, the government housing for low-income people, you can be on that wait list for 4 years before you get your own apartment. It's not going to work to live in a hotel for 4 years, and it's not going to work to live in a sober home for 4 years. That's not, it's a good temporary fix, but that's not a place where you build long-term emotional, mental, physical stability. So one thing that we really want to be able to do for our clients is provide a rental assistance program where we can help you get that apartment and we can cover 70% of the cost so that you can afford it. It's not $1,700 a month. It's not crazy expensive. And then we gradually transition you to 100% as you are financially able to do that. And that's, not everybody needs that. Some people get lucky and win the lottery and get an apartment before 4 years. But for those who aren't eligible for traditional housing programs or on years-long wait lists, this is an opportunity to not be stuck in housing limbo for years. So just to throw some numbers on this, we estimate phase 1 costs $3,000. That's how much it costs to pay for housing for 10 days. That's how much it costs to have trained peer and ally mentors. So to answer another question, we believe in the power of having both peers and allies. So mentors with lived experience and mentors who have lived experience with trauma, but not specifically trafficking, because they're two kind of different ways of looking at the world, and you need both supports in your life. So the financial assistance, the food, the clothing, all those things you need in phase 1, $3,000. Phase 2, and I know these numbers are a little crazy, but it costs $8,000 to $11,000 because you're looking at the cost of housing for 6 months alone. I mean, you're talking $500 to $800 a month just for housing. And then you talk about the alternative therapies that trafficking survivors really benefit from, like art therapy, animal therapy. That's another couple $100 a month. And then what if they need their car bills paid? What if they have outstanding debt that they need to pay off before they can do the next thing in their life?
Medical expenses.
Medical expenses. What if there's utility bills that need to be paid? There's all of these things. And so you're looking at $8,000 to $11,000. And then phase 3, again, you're looking at $7,000 to $10,000. And that's really dependent on how long someone is in phase 3 and how well they're doing. Maybe they get a good job right away and they're able to transition to paying for their own housing right away. Maybe it takes them 6 months to get a job. Maybe they're going to school and we want to support them in going to school. So we're paying more of that. We're providing more of a financial safety net so that they can go to school. Maybe they're in phase 3 for 2 years, and that's how you get $7,000 to $10,000. And again, you have to factor in the cost of highly trained mentors. And I just have to say, like here at the Underground, we believe that our staff should be making more than minimum wage because they're highly trained. They're often peer mentors. And so we want to give them a sustainable way of living. So when you factor in the cost of staff, that gets you there. And then when you look at Raise Up, which, I think is such a fantastic offering, but we're really not able to offer it to many people right now. That costs $12,000 to $25,000 over the course of 2 years to provide rental assistance for one person. Because if any of y'all have looked at the cost of apartments recently, you're looking at $1,200 minimum, $1,500 to $1,700 average to put them in a decent place that's not going to trigger them, that's safe, and that's a decent place to live. You're looking at, you know, $1,000, $1,200 a month. So that's the cost of freedom. It's really expensive to rebuild from this really, you know, kind of severe. I think trafficking has to be the most horrific form of trauma because it takes 10 different traumas and combines them. It takes sexual trauma, it takes physical trauma, it takes brainwashing, it takes religious trauma even. Traffickers will claim godlike abilities. Takes financial trauma. And it squishes them all together and does it all at once. And it's so hard to recover from all of that all at once.
So we're asking the question, how do we rebuild? And what can you do? What can I do? What can each individual here do to help? What role can we play in rebuilding? And so one of the things the underground um, has decided to do is to launch uh, a campaign, End of the Wait campaign. As it is right now, we have 12 individuals enrolled in our mentor program. There are 10 males, 10 females, and there are 2 males. We have a growing waiting list. At the last count, we had 15 individuals waiting to get into the adult mentor program here at the underground. Why are they waiting on the list? Every time we've shared that, and the numbers have grown over the weeks, we get the question, Amy, why are they waiting? Why don't you have them in the program? What happens while they're waiting? You know, what's going on with them while they're waiting?
I don't like that question. That makes it hard for me to sleep at night. But the answer is, you know, Marianne put in the chat, it looks like it costs $50,000 from day one to raise up. Yeah, at the most expensive, that's right. You know, we estimate, you know, everybody's story is different. So we estimate that we can kind of finesse our way around and make it cost more like $18,000, $24,000 for one person. That's a lot of money. And to be honest, we just don't have that money right now to serve those 15 people. And so we're choosing to serve the 12 people in our program really well, and then pray that we get the funds to bring those other people in off the wait list, because that's really the only reason that we have people on the wait list is we don't have the funds to provide them services. Alice, AMP stands for Adult Mentor Program. That's our program that we serve survivors through. So,
okay.
Yep, go ahead, Nadine.
No, you go ahead, Amy.
So I want to say 2 things. And we are going to get to your questions in a second. We just wanted to kind of wrap this up because the cost is such a big piece of recovery. And the Wait is a campaign that we're launching for the next 2 months because we're tired of not being able to sleep at night. And we're tired of worrying about what's happening to these 15 individuals on the wait list. And I have to say, I literally get calls every week from the FBI, from law enforcement, from survivors calling me themselves, from pregnancy centers, from other agencies. We get calls literally every week asking if they can add someone to the wait list, asking if we can provide any resources while we have them on the wait list. So it's 15 right now, but who knows what it's going to be in a month. And where that funding comes from is individuals and churches. Those are our primary sources. We do get some government funding, but we have to be very careful how we use that because our vision for this program is to be really flexible and quick, like very flexible and very quick in responding to the needs of somebody. And the reality of government funding is, well, it's wonderful and we're going after it and we're trying to use it, it is not great at being super flexible and quick.
Yeah,
and so we have to have individual sponsors and church sponsors in order to be able to have that quick, flexible response where there's no red tape and it's like, you need this, yes, we'll get it. So that is our goal, is to raise 360,000 in the next 2 months, because that's how much it would cost to sponsor those 15 survivors for 1 year. And that would allow us to bring them in off the wait list and provide them services. Lori, great question. We do get some grants. Again, that is unreliable. We found that churches and individuals are much more reliable because grants are, for 1 year at a time. You don't know if you're going to get them next year. And some of them, you can only get them for 1 year, and then you have to wait before you can apply again. So while grants are a wonderful resource, we've learned it's not responsible or wise on our part to rely on that. Because the last thing I want to do, and this is why I love the idea of sponsorship, the last thing I want to do is bring someone into our program, promise them the world, tell them we'll help them, and then come back to them 12 months later and say, I'm sorry, we ran out of funding. Like, that sounds horrible. So
Yeah.
with that, Nadine.
Thank you, Amy. So that's really where and I totally agree with you. And that answers that's the answer we give when we get the question. So, what happened to the 15 people who wait? It is, it would not be good for anyone for us to bring these individuals in and we're not able to give them the kind of care. Right now we have 12 individuals and we are working assiduously. Our mentors are going over and beyond to take care of these individuals and just to give them that guidance into the life of freedom. And so this End the Wait campaign that we're launching, that we have launched tonight, there's a link to the campaign in the chat. There's the QR code on the screen, on your screen. If you should be able to access that on your phone. Support and not only support this campaign, we're asking you, but also share it among your family, among your friends, among your circle of influence. It's for a great cause. Right now, there are 15 individuals who are waiting to get their lives in order. They're waiting for us to bring the light into the darkness that has permeated their lives. And that I can promise you, if anyone, if you call either Amy or myself or the underground, in the next 2 weeks, we're going to tell you that that number has grown because we get referrals almost every day. We get referrals. But to have individuals into the program is gonna cost us at least $360 to get them into the program and to get the care that they need. And so this is where we end for tonight. Thank you so much for being with us. We have a lot of questions that we're going to be answering, as many as we can right now. Lori, will you please help us with some of these questions? But before we start the questions, I just want you to know that there's a survey, and is it a survey, Amy? At the end of, please, it will be in the chat also. Please go ahead and fill that out. And we're asking you to just share with us your thoughts on the webinar and other information that would really help us in the future. Okay, so
you want some
let's
questions?
answer some questions.
All right. How educated are the people working in the court system? Are they familiar with the topic of trafficking, such as judges, police, public defenders?
Oh, this is such a good question. And I don't want to paint everybody with the same brush. So I am sure there's some really educated people in the court system. I'm going to call out some people that are super educated. Sheila Hare is a fantastic attorney who teaches at Quinnipiac. She's so amazing. She's so educated. She's advocated so hard for trafficking survivors. So someone like her, fantastic, and she does so much work. The state attorney is part of a trafficking task force, an anti-trafficking task force that we're also part of. And she is so dedicated to providing the state's legal support to survivors of trafficking. She's so dedicated to bringing down the traffickers. And that's, I mean, that's huge and that's amazing that we have the state attorney's ear, that I can go into a meeting and tell her a story and she'll say, yeah, what do you need? Let's get them witness protection. Let's get them whatever they need. So those people are fantastic. But then at the same time, you know, just to give you a story from like just last week, one of our mentors went to court with a client, and the client was trying to get a protective order against her trafficker. The victim advocate didn't understand trafficking and wasn't able to explain to the judge why this protective order, why is this trafficking, why do they need this support? And so our staff had to end up like going up and kind of taking over for the victim advocate and explaining to the judge why they needed the protective order, what trafficking is, why they need the support, and how they need to be kept safe. And they not only did they have to advocate to the judge, they also had to advocate. They literally followed the client back to the domestic violence shelter to make sure that they weren't being followed. Like that's how dedicated the staff was. Like, okay, nobody else is taking care of you, so we're going to do this. And the good news is, you know, the judge listened. It was wonderful. They gave, you know, the full protective order. The client is safe. So it's kind of a both and. Some people are really educated and working really hard. But then there's a lot of people who aren't educated.
Yeah. There's a lot of room for education. And that's why on the ground, we embark on awareness events. And we're trying the years to come to go into as many sectors as possible with, you know, awareness events, teaching about human trafficking, the basics, at least, at very least. And another question, Lori?
Oh, Lori,
Yes.
before you read the next question, sorry, I want to do one question that we got online ahead of time. Because I actually reached out to one of the survivors that we know to answer this question. I wanted to share her words. So someone asked how do survivors cope with what they experienced? And she responded, you know, as far as coping, she first used drugs to escape and numb herself so she didn't have to deal with it. But once she put those down, she said, I had to do a lot of inner work, therapy, group therapy, and treatment for my mental health. I found things that brought me joy and laughter. I built friendships with other women who could relate to me and allow me to be my authentic self, and a lot of prayers asking God for help. I had to talk about what I went through a lot and own my story so that I could accept it and grow from it. So I just wanted to share her words because I think that in a nutshell is what we're trying to do with the Adult Mentor Program, is provide those resources, those friendships, that walking alongside as you rebuild. All right, Lori, what do you got?
Sure. So there's so many good ones. Why do the survivors have to go to prison in some cases, in so many cases?
Yeah, I mean, that's so complicated. That's going to be my answer to all these questions, and they're great questions. I think the first thing is they were forced into committing crimes. But if they're not willing to identify that there's a trafficker forcing them to do that because they're so scared of the trafficker, then they're still going to go to jail for those crimes. And so a big piece of what we're doing with the state's attorney is trying to kind of connect the legal department to the survivors and kind of show them that, like, you don't have to go to jail. Like, we can help you. If you are able to share your story with us, we can help you. But then the reality is, you know, we're working with adult survivors. So we're looking at people who may have been trafficked when they were like 12 through 25. Now they're 35. They were sentenced when they were 25. They're just now getting out, trying to rebuild their life. There was no one there to advocate for them when they were 25. And that goes back to the waiting list, is like, for the people who are in the program, we can advocate for them. We can help them not go to jail. We can write letters. We can go to court. We can talk to the judges. But for so many people, there's just no one there to help them. I think that's the biggest reason, is if there was somebody there to help them say, hey, I was trafficked, I shouldn't have to go to jail for this, then that would be a whole different story. But there's just not enough people who are able to provide that kind of support.
Okay. At what age or school grade should a child be made aware of the dangers, pitfalls, and traps of human trafficking?
Ooh. I'll let Nadine give a recommendation as to age, but here's what I'll say. don't give a child social media and don't give a child a smartphone. I know it's countercultural. I know it's hard, but it is so prevalent to be trafficked online. Snapchat, TikTok, um, Facebook, Instagram. These are all places where traffickers are trying to get a hold of young people and coerce them and blackmail them. So just don't even give them access to that until they're old enough to know how to handle it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think too that if I were to add to that, we teach our children a lot of things about the dangers that surround us, social dangers. And I think human trafficking is one such social danger, especially sextortion, which is becoming so prevalent among young people now, that as early as our kids can understand what that looks like, then we should, we should be able to talk to our children about that and create that safe space. And this leads me to a question that we got for registration, um, which I found just so fascinating. What advice would a survivor give to her younger self from her vantage point today? And reaching out to a survivor, the advice she would give to her younger self was to identify what your core values and beliefs are. Walk through life in a way that aligns with those values and beliefs. During when the first opportunity to get out presents itself, take it. Um, and I can really understand what she's trying to say. Basically, if we teach our children these values and just teach our children what dangers there are, then that's I mean, as young as they are able to understand, and then we should do that.
Yeah.
Another question, Lori? We
Yep.
can take how many more questions, Amy?
I think we have 10 more minutes. So
Okay, so there's several good ones, but are the number of immigrants coming in across the border getting involved in human trafficking? Are the children getting caught up in that are coming over the border?
um yes and no. Certainly, we are seeing a lot of trafficking with people, with migrants. We're seeing a lot of trafficking. I think basically what makes somebody super vulnerable to trafficking is lack of income, lack of resources, lack of upward mobility. And so anytime you see a situation where somebody is without those resources, whether it's a migrant, whether it's someone who's homeless, whether it's, somebody who has disabilities, any of those things are going to make you vulnerable. And yeah, so yes, it is happening. Is it happening to every single one? No. But is it happening? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, is there any new legislation being worked on that we can support?
Nothing new that has come across my desk recently, but I would suggest that we because I do that. I search through just to see what's happening um on the legal landscape, especially as it relates to not only human trafficking specifically, but other things that will affect a survivor, such as, any changes to housing, any legislation related to housing or healthcare or anything legally that would affect their process. So that's what I would suggest. But I haven't seen anything recently coming across my desk. Anything, Amy? Have you seen
Not
anything
that I
new?
know of recently, no.
Yeah.
There was a couple, how do you plan to expand the program to New England? And then there's one less, one more after that.
Well, Nadine, I feel like that gets into the strategic vision of the executive director.
Exactly. That's definitely a part of our strategic vision in the years to come. That's something we're working on. Connecticut, as it is still such a wide open field. a ready harvest for us. We still have a lot of work to do, in our domicile state. And so we are focusing right now on Connecticut, but we definitely, the thing though is we're still open to partnership. We're open to, hosting awareness events with other agencies and organizations or anyone who would like us to come in the New England area. But in terms of, reaching our services, our programs into those areas, it's not for the very now future. I mean, not for the very now, definitely for the future, but not now.
Yeah, I think
Are
for
the-
right now, our connection to Greater New England is those agency relationships. Because I get calls,
Yeah,
I get calls from crisis lines
we do.
outside Connecticut that are saying, "Hey, what do I do?" And so that kind of like,
Mhm.
peer support we provide,
We
even if it's
support, right?
And I
yeah.
think when we started this, when the underground was started, we just had no idea of the depth of trafficking taking place in Connecticut alone. So it's, that one
Yeah,
was back in its infancy. So New England is a goal, but
Yeah,
like you said, Connecticut's first.
Connecticut, then New England, then the world. We'll get there.
Yeah. Are there shelters? This is quite a long one, but are there shelters in Connecticut for trafficking victims like there are for domestic violence and sex violence? And then for transitional housing, where's the funding coming from? We've been struggling to find transitional housing for domestic violence victims. And then are there grants for trafficking victims that other agencies can access too? And how can we collaborate as agencies to end trafficking or at least bring awareness? Where does your work end with survivors?
That's such a great question. Wait, Lori, are you able to tell me who asked that?
Yeah, I can.
Because clearly they need to come to our next strategy meeting. Um,
Well, I can, Annie.
Oh, Annie, yes. Annie, I think I actually met you once last year, and I think you are also a nonprofit. So, honestly, some of that is like I could take an hour to answer your question. So shoot us an email and let's do that. Kind of the high level answer to that is no, there are not trafficking shelters. And that's why we provide the hotel stays. That's why we provide that, month in the sober home, because there isn't a trafficking shelter we can send them to. I think that we're really actively working on is building relationships with domestic violence shelters so that they'll take survivors of trafficking. We have one relationship in one part of the state where they will take trafficking survivors, even if they're not actively fleeing domestic violence, because often you have domestic violence and trafficking. But for those who are just trafficking or where they're homeless and they were trafficked 5 years ago, which is why they're homeless now, but they're not actively fleeing trafficking. That's where we're still trying to build relationships. I was talking to a donor who said she might be able to connect me to a domestic violence shelter to have a conversation. So would love to have more conversations like that. In the meantime, hotels is the best that we're able to provide. In terms of grants, there are some grants specifically for agencies that serve trafficking victims. And would love to, like I said, Annie, have a longer conversation with that. As far as how can we collaborate as agencies, I think one of the biggest things to do is make sure that every agency is trained on trafficking, trained on recognizing it, trained on assessing it, or knowing who to call if you are having questions about assessing it. And just creating this really strong collaborative relationship where you can pick up a phone and say, hey, I've got something for you. What do you think? Because even if we can't provide services, even if we have a wait list, we can still provide advice. We can still talk through what you might want to do. I'm happy to give people the list. When I get a call for emergency services, there's like a list that starts rolling in my head of like, got to do this, I got to do this, I got to do this. So I'm happy to tell people that list. So yeah, that's kind of the short answer. Where does our work end with survivors? That's a great question. In some ways it doesn't end, right? But in terms of graduation, we do not graduate people until they have independent housing for 6 months and they have independent income for 6 months. So basically we're saying when you can show us that you are able to financially, emotionally, physically, mentally live on your own and pay all of your bills on your own for 6 months, that's when I feel comfortable graduating you from the program. And even then, please stay in touch. Please still come to our events. Because what we've seen is it's so easy to have success for kind of a month, to have income for a month, to have housing for a month, but keeping it long enough, that's the challenge. And so, yeah, we try to work with them as long as possible.
Right, let's take this question from Dave. I'm not sure where we're at, but let's just, if we can finish with this one if need be. Connecticut legislation has been making some headway to expunging criminal activity cases that survivors face, which occurred while they were trafficked, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so I mentioned Sheila earlier, and I'm sure others were involved with this. One of the big laws that was passed was the vacatur law, so that you can get your record vacated if the charges were due to trafficking. And that's huge, because
Yeah.
now you can apply for a job without having a felony record. What I would say though is that process is still time consuming. You don't necessarily know how to do it. And there might be costs along the way in terms of getting paperwork and things like that. So one of the pieces we do is help survivors go through that vacatur process.
Wow. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all so much for being with us. I know there's just we haven't even scratched the surface of the information that we have, that we could share. I know there are so many more questions that, need to be answered, but I'm so happy that we were able to be here with you this evening to share with you, just a little bit of information. We hope you've learned something. We hope you've been made aware of what it is that survivors go through, what it is that how the underground reaches out to help these individuals, and what that help looks like in terms of, time and money. And so you've heard some of the stories of our survivors. You've heard their own voices. Well, those few minutes that you were able to actually hear their voices, but you've read their words. Um, you've seen what it costs to take care of one such individual. And so you've heard about the End the Wait campaign. And so we're just asking you to share this information with as many people as you can. That's how we spread awareness. Talk with your young people. That's how we create prevention. That's called prevention. Please fill the survey. Please complete the survey in the chat. That helps us moving forward with our program. And just thank you so much. Thank you for your support. A lot of you have been to some of our awareness events. I know there's some donors here, supporters here. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you for your prayers, because that really sustains us and really sustains the people that we work with. And so we just look forward to seeing you at our next event, and just to welcome your support and your encouragement along the way. Amy, do you have any final words?
I don't know how to compete with that, Nadine. But I just want to say, like I said, like Nadine said, thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time to be here. I think one of the biggest passions of my heart is community. I want to build community for every survivor that comes through our doors. And I want you guys to know that I truly think of you as part of that community, whether you're just by giving, by being a monthly sponsor, that's creating community, because our survivors know where the money's coming from. They know that it's churches, that it's individuals that care about them enough to give money to provide services, and that honestly speaks the world to them. It lets them know that somebody cares about them and values them enough for them to get services. But then also, by coming to these events, by sharing what you hear in this with people around you, all of that makes you part of our community. And so I just want to say thank you. And I want you to know that we truly value you and we want to connect with you. We want to get to know you better. I know there was questions that got sent in when you registered that we didn't get to. So please, if we didn't get to a question, you still have it, send us an email, give us a call. We want to talk to you. We want to get to know you better. So thank you again.
Thank you, guys. Good night.
Good night.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thanks for coming.
Good night and thank you.
Good night. Thank you, Latif.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Okay, I'm stop there.